My name is Kaylee Trim, and this is my final project for the Synoptic Gospels. To start us off, I just wanted to explain what a gospel was, or is. A gospel is a teaching or representation of Jesus. So, growing up, I always understood the Gospels as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but in this class specifically, we talked about the Synoptic Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So to start us off, I think we kind of need to first explain what the synoptic problem is and what separates these three from and individualizes them outside of the four that maybe we all grew up understanding. So the synoptic problem is the literary relationship between all of the Gospels. So there's many similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are almost identical books, and they're very similar in most everything. But John is quite different. The style of John is a lot different. Number one, John starts and he says, "In the beginning." So rather than just talking about Jesus or giving a lineage of Jesus or so on, he starts it from "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God," and that whole verse, which is super interesting because the other three, they started with the lineage and they just simply talked about Jesus's ministry, where John really wanted to start from the beginning, which also has to do with his plot. His plot was very different. He included aspects of Jesus' life and his ministry that the other three didn't. And his presentations of Jesus' words and deeds were quite a bit different from the others. John's book sets out, though it does talk about Jesus, it sets itself apart quite a bit. Something that I found really interesting in all of this was a lot of the different and similar names that were used across the Synoptic Gospels for Jesus. So the Son of Man, the title that means Jesus represents all man, and the Son of God, that refers to God as Jesus' Father. So just a side note on this, I always had a problem, or difficulty I should say, understanding how Jesus was 100% man and 100% God. But I find it really interesting that even in the Gospels, they were setting him apart, saying he is the Son of Man and he is the Son of God. And that kind of just explains that he's 100% man and 100% God. So he was also the Messiah. So the Messiah is the Greek word meaning the anointed one. So most of the New Testament was written in Greek, which is super cool. And Messiah was the word anointed one. So even when the angel came and said, "Your son will be the Messiah," or whatever, they were telling him from the very beginning of his birth that he was going to be the anointed one, which in all of their history, they'd been waiting for the anointed one to come and die and be the Messiah. And then also Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus is referred to many times as Jesus of Nazareth. And part of that's just to saying like Joseph's son or whatever, but Jesus of Nazareth made him the historical Jesus that we know. So there's been plenty of criticism in the analysis of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very similar. A lot of these criticisms have to do with things such as like source criticism, or it was people trying to establish the sources used by the authors of the biblical text. There's a lot of text criticism, many criticisms, because a lot of people want to disprove Christ, but then a lot of people also want to prove Christ. And what we're finding is that the criticism of these Gospels and people trying to disprove Jesus, the Gospels are only used to prove him that more. More so, and even so, I should say, a lot of the things that I find really interesting is we have things such as M and L, which are the unique, they're a collection of the things that are unique about each book, like Matthew, or Mark, or Luke. So Mark was the author of Mark, it sounds, and he was with Jesus, but Luke was a physician and he was a companion of Paul, and these two are quite similar. Though Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the most similar, John's portrayal adds to our understanding of how early Christians understood the person and message of Jesus. John used a lot of imagery and a lot of different ways to communicate, which I think is super cool, because though we have these 4 Gospels and we have the 3 Synoptic Gospels, though John is very different from the other 3, it's just another tool that we get to use to introduce people to Jesus and Jesus's life and his story, and what then makes us Christians and salvation and what gets us to heaven and all those things. So I just find that really interesting about this whole class, that even though they're different, we do have 4 Gospels and we have 3 Synoptic Gospels, 3 very similar Gospels. But John, he wrote and wrote and wrote to help us have a better understanding of who Jesus was.